The morning of Christmas Eve, I woke up at 5:30 the way I always do. 51 years of getting up before the sun. Old habits don't die when you retire. They just follow you into quieter mornings. I put the kettle on, walked to the front window, and looked out at the street. 6 inches of fresh snow had fallen overnight. The neighbors' lights were still off. The whole street was still, the way small towns in Ontario get still in December, like the world is holding its breath. I stood there in my housecoat with my tea, and I thought, today is going to be a good day. I was wrong. The house was quiet. Too quiet. My son and his wife had been living with me for 14 months by then, along with their 2 kids, my grandson who was 9, and my granddaughter who had just turned 6. We had an arrangement. They were going to a rough patch, job transitions, some credit problems they never fully explained. I told them they could stay until they got back on their feet. I paid the property taxes, the utilities, the groceries. I didn't ask for rent. I didn't ask for much at all, really. I just asked to be treated like a person who lived in his own house. I knocked on their bedroom door to see if the kids wanted to come help me shovel before breakfast. No answer. I knocked again. Nothing. I tried the handle. The door swung open. The room was empty. Not just empty, cleared. The bed was made, the closet door open, hangers bare. The dresser drawers hung open and vacant. No charger on the nightstand. No shoes by the door. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. I am 63 years old. I have buried a wife. I have sat with people in hospital waiting rooms. I know what shock feels like from the inside. It is very quiet. It is almost calm. I walked down the hall to the kids' room. Same thing. Beds stripped. Stuffed animals gone. The little wooden name sign my late wife had painted for my grandson when he was born. Gone from the wall. They had taken that too. I went back downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table. My tea had gone cold. There was a note on the counter, folded once, propped up against the fruit bowl like a grocery list. I unfolded it. Dad, we needed a break. We've gone away for the holidays. We'll call when we're back. Please don't worry. Merry Christmas. That was it. No details. No destination. No date of return. No phone number where they could be reached. I sat with that note for a long time. The kettle had finished boiling and no one came to make tea. Outside, the snow was still falling softly. A Canada Post truck rumbled past. Completely ordinary morning in a completely ordinary world. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that. I did not feel the urge to cry. What I felt was something colder and more precise, like a door closing slowly on a hinge that had been worn down for a very long time. My son's name is Owen. He is 37 years old. His wife, my daughter-in-law, is Priya. She is 34. I have known Priya since Owen brought her home for Thanksgiving almost 10 years ago. She is smart, charming when she wants to be. She calls me by my first name, which I never particularly liked, but I let it go because Owen seemed happy. In the 14 months they had lived under my roof, I had let a great many things go. I let it go when Priya redecorated the living room without asking me. She said the old furniture was depressing. My wife had chosen that furniture. I let it go. I let it go when Owen borrowed my F-150 for what he said was 1 weekend and kept it for 6 weeks. When I finally asked for it back, he acted as though I'd made an unreasonable demand. I let it go when I noticed, in October, that $200 was missing from the envelope I kept in my desk drawer. I kept cash there. Old habit, nothing suspicious, just how I was raised. When I asked Owen about it, he said maybe I miscounted. Maybe I had. I let it go. I let it go, and I let it go, and I let it go. And now they had gone to wherever people go when they want a holiday they can't afford. And they had left me alone in my house on Christmas Eve with a cold cup of tea and a note that didn't even say they were sorry. I folded the note and put it in my housecoat pocket. Then I went upstairs, showered, got dressed, and called my financial advisor. Her name is Winifred. She has been managing my accounts since before my wife got sick. She is meticulous and completely unsentimental, which is exactly what I needed that morning. I told her what had happened. There was a pause on the line. "Lawrence," she said. "My name is Lawrence. Tell me what you want to do." I told her. She said she would have everything arranged by end of business on the 26th. My wife, Margaret, died 4 years ago. Ovarian cancer, 19 months from diagnosis to end. She was 58. She used to say that the hardest thing about getting older wasn't the body. It was learning who people actually were, as opposed to who you'd assumed they were for decades. She said it with some sadness, but also a kind of peace. Margaret had a gift for seeing clearly. After she died, I was lost for a while. Not dramatically. I did not fall apart. I went to work, I came home, I ate, I slept, but there was a hollowness to everything that I couldn't quite locate. Owen called every week for the first month. Then every 2 weeks. Then once in a while. I understood. He had his own life. I didn't begrudge him that. When he called last October to say they were having trouble, that Priya had left her marketing job and Owen's landscaping business had hit a slow patch, that they were behind on rent and didn't want to put it on credit, I didn't hesitate. Of course they should come. The house was too big for one person anyway. The kids could have the upstairs rooms. We would make it work. I meant that. I meant every word of it. What I did not mean was to become invisible in my own home. The first thing I did after calling Winifred was drive to my brother's place in Barrie. My brother's name is Kenneth. He is 68, retired from the OPP, and about as easy to rattle as a fence post. I told him everything over coffee and a plate of shortbread his wife had made. He listened without interrupting, which is a skill not enough people have. When I finished, he said, "What do you need from me?" "Nothing right now," I said. "I just needed someone to know." He nodded. "All right. You know where I am." I drove back home through the snow. The roads were bad on the 400, but I didn't mind. I needed the drive. I needed the time to think clearly before I did anything else. Because here's what Owen and Priya did not know, and what I had never felt the need to explain to them. The house is mine. Fully and legally mine. Purchased in 1987, paid off in 2009, registered solely in my name. There is no co-ownership. There is no shared title. Margaret and I had discussed adding Owen to the deed at one point years ago, and we had decided against it for reasons that seemed minor at the time and now seemed, with considerable irony, quite foresighted. Owen and Priya were not tenants. They had never signed a lease. They had never paid rent. Under Ontario tenancy law, occupants living with the property owner without a formal tenancy agreement occupy a different legal standing than traditional tenants. I had looked this up in November after the cash went missing from my desk. Not because I'd made any decisions then, just because I believe in knowing where you stand. I knew exactly where I stood. The question was what to do about it. Christmas Day was, in its way, one of the more peaceful days I'd had in over a year. I made myself a proper breakfast, back bacon, eggs, toast with marmalade, and ate at the kitchen table without anyone asking me to move so they could spread craft supplies across it. I watched the Cardinals game. I called Kenneth and his wife to say Merry Christmas. I called my daughter, who lives in Vancouver with her partner and their dog. She had no idea any of this was happening, and I kept it that way for now, because she worries too much already, and there was nothing she could do from 3,000 kilometers away. I walked through the house that afternoon with fresh eyes. In 14 months, the wear was considerable. The living room baseboards had been scuffed by the kids' toys. I didn't blame the kids for that. They were children, but there were crayon marks on the wall in the hallway that no one had mentioned or offered to address. The kitchen faucet had developed a slow drip that Owen had promised to fix back in September. The back deck, my back deck, which I had built with my own hands over 3 weekends in the summer of 2002, had a board split down the middle because someone had left a heavy planter on it over winter and not moved it when I asked. I made a list, not out of anger, out of precision. On the 27th, Winifred called to confirm. Everything was arranged. I had made 4 moves. The first was to change the authorization on my joint household account, the account I had opened specifically for shared household expenses when Owen moved in. I was the primary account holder. It took one phone call and 20 minutes in the branch to remove Owen's access. The balance at that point was $4,000 and change. I transferred it to my personal account. The second move concerned the supplementary credit card. When Owen moved in, I had added him as an authorized user on one of my cards for household purchases, groceries, home repairs, that kind of thing. In September, I had noticed charges that didn't fit that description. A spa visit in Collingwood, a dinner at a restaurant I'd never heard of, a purchase at a sporting goods store for $280 with no explanation offered and none requested by me at the time. Because, at the time, I was still letting things go. I contacted the bank on the 26th and had his access revoked. The third move was a letter, drafted with the help of a paralegal I know in town, delivered by registered mail to Priya's parents' address in Mississauga, where I had a reasonable suspicion they might be reached, and to Owen's cell phone as a legal notice of termination of occupancy. The letter was factual, measured, and gave them 30 days from January 1st to collect their remaining belongings and vacate the premises. I was not throwing anyone out in the snow. I was giving them a month. A generous month. The fourth move was the one I hadn't entirely planned, but which felt, once I'd done it, entirely right. I called an estate sale company, not to sell everything immediately, but to have them come through and assess. Because, in the living room, among the furniture that Priya had rearranged without asking, there were items that were mine. My wife's china cabinet, a mahogany side table that had come from my parents' home. Several pieces of art we had bought together over the years. I wanted them cataloged. I wanted documentation of what was in my house and what belonged to whom before Owen and Priya came back and anything became confused. The woman from the estate company, her name was Gwendolyn. She was thorough and professional, walked through on the 28th and photographed everything systematically. She made no judgments. She did her job. I appreciated that. Owen called on December 30th. I watched the phone ring 3 times, stopped, then rang again, then stopped. I did not answer. He texted, "Dad, we're back in town. We went to Priya's sister's place in Montreal for the holidays. I tried to use the visa and it was declined. Is something wrong with the account? Is something wrong with the account?" I did not reply. 2 minutes later, Dad. Then, 5 minutes after that, Dad, I'm going to come by the house. He did come by the house. I heard his rental car pull up. He had apparently left the F-150 in the driveway while they were gone, which I will admit surprised me slightly. I had expected him to take it. I watched from the upstairs window. He sat in the car for a few minutes. Then he got out and came to the door. I went downstairs and opened it before he could knock. He looked tired. He had always been a handsome boy, my son. He had his mother's eyes. He was looking at me now with an expression I couldn't quite classify, somewhere between contrite and defensive, waiting to see which approach would be necessary. I handed him the copy of the registered letter. He looked at it. He looked at it. He said, I said, "I'm not going to have this conversation on the doorstep. It's cold. Come in." He came in. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat with the note on Christmas Eve morning. I made tea. I am a Canadian. I make tea when things are difficult. He tried several things. He said they had needed a break. I said I understood that, but that leaving without a word was not how adults who are guests in someone's home conduct themselves. He said he thought I'd understand. I said he might have tried asking. He said Priya had thought it would be easier this way. I said I didn't doubt that Priya had thought so. He said, "You're being pretty cold about this." I said, "Owen, I ate Christmas dinner alone." He didn't have a response to that. He sat with it. I let him sit with it. He asked about the bank account. I explained that the joint account had been for household expenses, and since there was no longer a shared household arrangement to speak of, it had been restructured. He asked about the visa. I mentioned the Collingwood spa and the unexplained sporting goods charge, and said I felt the arrangement had been misused. He started to say something, then stopped. He asked about the letter. I told him it was what it appeared to be. They had 30 days from January 1st. He asked where they were supposed to go. I said that was a question for him and Priya to work out, but that they were welcome to use the 30 days to make arrangements. I told him the kids were welcome to visit me whenever they liked. I meant that too. He looked at me across the kitchen table, the table I had built in the spring of 1993, the table at which he had eaten roughly 1,500 childhood dinners. And he said, "I didn't think you'd do something like this." I looked back at him and I said, "I know." The 30 days passed. Priya never spoke to me directly. Owen came twice more to collect belongings. Both times brief, both times stiff, both times with Priya waiting in the car. My grandson waved at me through the car window on the second visit. I waved back. I will not pretend that was easy. By the end of January, the house was mine again in every sense. I repainted the hallway. I fixed the kitchen faucet. I put new boards on the back deck. I moved the china cabinet back to where Margaret had always kept it. In February, I started volunteering 2 mornings a week at the food bank in town, something I had meant to do for years and kept putting off. The coordinator is a woman named Harriet, widowed herself, late 60s, practical and funny in a dry way that I find very agreeable. We have had coffee after a shift twice now, nothing more than that. But it is something. I have not been able to reach Owen since January. He does not return my calls. I hold on to the fact that this is not permanent. Parents and children have come back from worse than this. I believe that. Some days I believe it more easily than others. What I know for certain is this. I spent too long making myself small in my own life, in my own home, out of a desire not to be inconvenient. I am 63 years old, and I have a house I own outright, and a pension that covers my needs and a brother who answers the phone and, apparently, the beginnings of something resembling a life again. Margaret would have found the whole thing deeply unsurprising. She would have poured herself a cup of tea. She always used the good cups. She said there was no point in saving them, and she would have looked at me with that particular clear-eyed calm of hers, and she would have said, "Well, better late than never, Lawrence." She would have been right. She usually was. I have thought about that Christmas Eve morning more times than I can count, not with bitterness, or at least not only with bitterness, more the way you turn a stone over in your hand and look at it properly for the first time, after years of stepping around it without really seeing it. What happened in my house over those 14 months did not happen all at once. It happened the way most slow damage happens, in small permissions. A borrowed truck kept too long, cash gone from a drawer, a living room rearranged without a word asked. Each one, taken alone, was easy to excuse. Taken together, they told a story I had been unwilling to read. That is the part I have had to sit with. Not what Owen and Priya did, what I allowed. Because kindness without limits is not really kindness. It is an abdication. When I kept letting things go, I told myself I was being a good father, a patient man, a person who doesn't make trouble. What I was actually doing was teaching Owen, slowly and consistently, that there were no consequences for taking me for granted. I set that up. I am honest enough to say it. The people we love most are the ones we are most willing to excuse, and sometimes excusing them is the most harmful thing we can do, for them as much as for ourselves. Owen is 37 years old. He is not a child, the version of him that left a folded note on the counter on Christmas Eve and flew to Montreal without a word. That version was shaped, in part, by years of watching me absorb whatever came without drawing a line. I do not say this to punish myself. I say it because it is true, and because the truth is the only place you can start from if you actually want to change anything. What I did in the days that followed was not revenge in any way I'm proud to dramatize. It was correction. It was the setting of terms that should have been set much earlier. Winifred arranged the accounts. The paralegal drafted the letter. I walked through my own house and saw it clearly for the first time in over a year. These were not dramatic acts. They were the quiet, necessary work of a man who had finally decided to respect himself enough to act like it. That is the thing about integrity. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. It is what you do when the house is empty and no one is watching, and you could just as easily pour a second cup of tea and wait for them to come home and pretend nothing happened. Integrity is the decision not to pretend. I do not know yet how things will resolve with Owen. I hope they resolve. I am his father, and that does not stop being true because we are estranged. But I know this. Whatever comes next, I will meet it as a man who knows the value of his own home, not just the house, but the life inside it. The china cabinet back where Margaret always kept it. The faucet fixed, the deck boards replaced. These are small things. They are also everything. You cannot pour from an empty vessel, and you cannot give your children something real if you have hollowed yourself out trying to keep the peace. The most useful thing I can offer Owen now, if he is ever willing to receive it, is the example of a man who finally, at 63, decided that his own life was worth protecting. Margaret knew. She always knew. I just needed a little longer to catch up.